Hey community, welcome to our sermon podcast for wanderers, seekers, and thinkers, for deconstructing and reconstructing. This is a feed of Open Door Church, a faith community focused on God's love and grace, a progressive church built around action, community, and people. Enjoy this week's message and check back often as we're posting new content every week. So last week, I shared with you a little bit of my story. Not like I shared something new, I don't think. I think for many of you, you've heard at least pieces of that story. But kind of what we did was talk about how liberation theology brought me and a few close people around me some light at the end of a tunnel when questions weren't answered by our tradition or by our church or by what we had been taught. And through that process kind of gave me a path forward. And so I thought that even though I mention it, even though it informs a lot of things that we do here at Open Door, I thought we would actually take sort of a deep dive into the scary and dangerous liberation theology over the next few weeks. And so that's where we started, and I would like to continue that this morning on Scripture and thinking just about the way that we read Scripture. Here's why. A big piece of liberation theology is actually about interpretation. As we talked last week, a big piece of it is reading Scripture or understanding faith through the lens of those on the margins, through the lens of those who have been oppressed. And just the simple idea, we did just a short exercise of thinking about Luke and chapter 4 as Jesus opens and begins his ministry from the place of I've come to rescue and to liberate and to set free. And what that means from a context of a mostly white, wealthy congregation in North America is very different from what that means if read to and through the lens of someone who is oppressed for who they love, or their political background, or their theological stances, or any number, their race or ethnicity. All of these places of marginalization and oppression give voice to reading Scripture a different way. And so this morning we're going to spend some time just on the Scripture side of things. And to start us, I'm going to give us a little bit of a precursor. Since I shared a little bit about my story last week, I'll share a little bit more this week. And I want to be clear, because as we go forward, it could sound like I don't respect or have reverence for the tradition that I came from. And the truth is actually that I have a great deal of respect and a great deal of admiration from where I came from and how I was raised and how I grew up. However, a lot of what was taught implicitly and sometimes explicitly shaped a view of God and the world that falls apart, quite frankly, in a deeper look. And not to be brass or rude or I don't know, degrading about that, just fell apart for me. And I know for many of you, similar traditions and similar stories put you in a similar headspace of a place that is dark and just doesn't add up and doesn't bring a lot of life to you. So let me tell a little bit about my background and that specific tradition that I grew up in. The broad movement was called the Restoration Movement. If we had the Reformation with Martin Luther and others, the Restoration movement is yet another moment and yet another attempt to look at the traditions and things that are taking place and say, something's not right. We need to, Restoration, restore the church and our faith back to its original starting place, which is an admirable goal and an admirable purpose, to go look at Jesus, to look at Jesus' disciples, and to look at the early church and go, what are we missing? Why are we not doing that? And that was the purpose, and that was the starting point. As with many traditions, if not all traditions, there is a canon sort of within the canon. And for that church, for that movement, the canon within the canon, or the scripture that is most focused on to set doctrine and theology and form or practice of the church, that for that church is Acts. You can see the story of Luke Acts, and you see the story of Jesus, and then it turns into the story of the church and the movement of the church in the early days. And so that's the restoration piece of things, was let's restore this back to the church in Acts. In that process for you, in that process, Scripture becomes extreme in its reading, in its understanding, in the way that it is interpreted. And let me explain a little bit of that. So with the Reformation process, you've heard sola scriptura. It means Scripture alone. We are going to interpret, and that's a tricky word here, but we are going to take Scripture and we're going to use that to inform our churches. We're going to use that to inform our theology. We're going to use that to inform our practice and what we do and how we live out our faith and what we believe. For different people, sola scriptura means different things. And I like to think about the tradition that I grew up in that Restoration movement. The sola scriptura was sort of the extreme end of what it means to read Scripture alone. It is, in fact, to say traditions are not real. It is, in fact, to say we can't base anything off of traditions. We can only go back and read Scripture. The problem with that, of course, is that we read Scripture with an interpretive lens, and we cannot avoid that. We like to think we can avoid that. We would love to be the one person on earth that has figured out how to read a plain reading Scripture straight and not have any other influences. Unfortunately, it's not real. It's not possible. It's not doable. But when you believe that that is what you are doing, it leads you into some difficult places. For my tradition, sola scriptura meant we are going to read only Scripture. It is the only thing that will inform our theology, our faith, our tradition, our practice, and what we believe. Which is why the idea of restoration is to go back to the early church. All of the tradition in between is moot in that story, in that narrative of sola scriptura. Okay, so why is this important right now? It's important because when you tell yourself that you are going to read Scripture alone, and that's going to inform your belief, you hide from yourself. Okay, this is a weird statement, but you hide from yourself your own interpretive lens. If you believe, as if you drove into the parking lot of my church growing up and you saw on the license plates of many cars in the parking lot, I wasn't going to name the church, but I guess I am. Church of Christ, founded AD 33. As in, nothing else happened. We've only got the church in AD 33 and now the Church of Christ, which is humorous and was intended to be, not to be boastful or anything like that, just a gaffe. But when you believe that to be the case, you hide from yourself your own interpretive lens. The problem is that most of us hide from ourselves our own interpretive lens. Most of us come to Scripture with bias. We come to Scripture with an idea already formed. Now, that might be our tradition. If you grew up in the church, you have basically 2 decades of somebody telling you what Scripture means and how you're supposed to read it that has to be undone and acknowledged for you to read Scripture without that lens in front of you. But for most of us, we don't undo that. We don't recognize or acknowledge our bias. We don't acknowledge the lens through which we read. And so we read with whatever shaded color glasses we come to the table with. For my tradition, that was coming to the table with a lens that we are reading without tradition and through a perfectly plain reading of the text. It was not uncommon for me to hear growing up, "Speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent." Let me give you an example. If you are unwilling to read outside of Scripture in the extreme, you might take a look at the church in Acts and read nowhere in that story about instruments. They met, they gathered, they worshiped together, they prayed together, they taught one another, and there is no mention of instruments. So how does our church respond? We have no instruments. There is no instruments in Acts. There is no instruments in our church. So here we are. That would be a mistake because we can look historically at catacombs throughout the region that have drawings of instruments. We obviously can read in other places in Scripture with a strong psalmic influence and instrumental accompaniment, and yet we don't see it in Acts, so we don't include it. That is an extreme version of sola scriptura. Luther's version was actually something a little more subtle and a little less direct. Luther's version included an idea that you would read Scripture and interpret outside traditions and faith and what you experience through Scripture, meaning that Scripture alone is guiding us, but it is helping us inform our other experiences. The Wesleyan tradition, which I've come to appreciate, uses a quadrilateral in their understanding of revelation from God, meaning that we have Scripture and tradition and experience and reason, quadrilateral. And through those 4 things, they work together at informing our faith and our theology and our practice. But we still come to that with a bias, with an interpretive lens. Tradition and Scripture is a little bit convoluted in the sense that it's very difficult for us to understand the bias held within our tradition, and it's very difficult for us to step outside of that bias to interpret Scripture in a new way. Before we get into Scripture this morning, let me give you a quick example. I sat down with a gentleman to talk about women in the church. Notice that there are no women in the conversation. Strike one. In this conversation, we have a friendly disagreement about how women should be viewed in the church, and biblically, how we should be interpreting Scripture that references women in the church. Now, I don't intend to vilify what you might call a traditional interpretation or whatever word you want to use. I don't intend to vilify that, because I actually don't think he was able to step outside of the tradition with which he was given to have a genuine conversation. By that I mean he could not acknowledge his bias within the conversation to move outside. And so as we read Scripture together and discuss women's roles in church and family, he proceeds to tell me, based on Scripture, that it is the man's role to protect and, as the bride of Christ for the church, lift up your wife. So many problems. My apologies. Blameless and pure before God. As if to say, and here's the problem, you can't have this conversation because the bias is so, it's very difficult to have this conversation. But as if to say that the man's role in the household is to protect and ultimately to save through Scripture his wife. Okay, so we're stepping all over problems with gender norms and expectations and family structures and everything here, but only to identify this situation. So he says, okay, let me tell you a story to help explain. This is after he's been telling me about how his role is to protect and to lift up. He says, my wife and I are looking at buying a new house. And we come and look at two houses. I've been able to rule out houses that are, maybe problematic for structural issues or something like that. And we have two houses, and one of them is a better investment, but my wife really likes the other one because of, I don't remember the details here, because of this or that. But I know that we should have this one that has this better investment to it. And he says, which one do you think we bought? And I said, well, knowing that he wants me to answer a specific way, I said, well, based on your story and our last 30 minutes, you would protect her by buying the one that is a better investment. And he says, no, see, you've missed it entirely. We bought the one that she wanted. And his reasoning here is that he protects her from ill feelings of not getting the house that she wanted. And I can't even comprehend what's happening in this conversation, because everything is focused on the bias that he comes to the table with, the interpretation that his tradition has brought him, and misses the point and misses the reading of women leading their husbands in Scripture, of women leading the church, of the woman that we did a few weeks ago that literally walked away from everything grand, including her husband, and followed Jesus. But this is his argument that comes through his understanding of the world, that comes through his tradition, that comes through everything that has been laid out before him. And to set aside our bias is a very difficult thing to do. It is maybe the most difficult thing we do, to understand and to acknowledge. And we, to be quite honest, fail to do that properly. Probably even the most academic or the most willing to set aside their tradition still fail to set aside their bias in an effort to do this. I want to look at one passage this morning. This gets a little bit hairy, but as we think about tradition and Scripture being convoluted to tear apart, I want to look at something that has been handed down for centuries with a very specific reading of it. And And the reason for that is because I think it is quite easy. I think it is quite easy to see the extremes and to see how our bias leads us to assumptions and conclusions within the text. So this might get a little bit difficult, and I guess I should apologize for that. I don't know, maybe not. We're going to read a few pieces of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, our traditions have handed down to us Sodom and Gomorrah as a story, quite frankly, lewdly, about same-sex erotic behavior. Unfortunately, even within Scripture itself, we are not given that explanation about what Sodom and Gomorrah is about. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening. We're in chapter 19 of Genesis. And Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords," not in an official, like, God, lords equal God, but in a respectful way, a term used for respect. "Turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, and you can rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do the same as you please. Do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Now, traditionally, we've been told that this story is about sex. We've told that this story is about, frankly, same-sex sex. The reality is that our traditions have given this to us, and it has been so difficult to step outside of what our tradition teaches that we come with such bias that we're unable often to recognize and acknowledge that bias and to read it any other way. Just before this story, we have a story about hospitality. As we move into this story, we see a strangers in a foreign land, and we have laws throughout our Hebrew scriptures focused on hospitality. We have actually texts within Hebrew scriptures interpreting Sodom and Gomorrah as a story about being hospitable to the other, to the neighbor, to the stranger. Yet, a concerted effort over hundreds of years has driven our interpretation to one singular idea about same-sex erotic behavior in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But this is about power. This is about oppression. This is about dominance. It is the reason that when Lot woefully, in a really bad form and in an unacceptable way, offers his daughters, and they are unwilling to offer that as consolation because it's not about sex, because it's about power and oppression and dominance. It's about a lack of love and grace and hospitality. Not in a Southern hospitality, I need to have you over for dinner kind of way, but in a welcoming the stranger and the other and lifting up those who are in the most vulnerable places in our society kind of way. That is the hospitality of our Hebrew scriptures. But watching our traditions interpret this through the lens of sex over hundreds of years, and then listening to it growing up, as you may have done through the conservative, evangelical, or other fundamentalist framework, there is only one possible interpretation. A plain reading obviously tells you how you're supposed to interpret this text. But Scripture doesn't even interpret this text that way. When Jesus says to the 12, go from town to town, and if they don't accept you, then they shall be treated like Sodom, it is not intending that they have been raped by the people. It is intending to acknowledge that they have lacked the hospitality that Sodom and Gomorrah also lacked. The story is not at all about sex, and yet we have solely through our bias and our interpretation and our surroundings of tradition and society have interpreted it one way only. In a very starkly contrasted narrative, we can see how big the divide can be when we interpret a story through the eyes of a stranger, and when we or oppressed or marginalized, and when we interpret a story through the eyes of our tradition or our surroundings or our upbringing without acknowledging our bias. Until we acknowledge that we've grown up in that tradition, until we acknowledge that we have grown up in a patriarchal society with patriarchal tendencies at every turn of every corner, then we can't come back and read Scripture faithfully. This is a cornerstone of the liberation theological movement. To say, I must acknowledge the bias with which I read Scripture. The sad part of this story is that not only have we taken our interpretation and our biases with us, but then we have taught it and passed it down. And it's not simply the practice or the form or a society that then at that moment is oppressive. It is our actual teachings that become oppressive in the church. Let's go back to that conversation that I had at the diner with the gentleman about women and the church. In his view, his job, his role, his part of his purpose as a faithful Christian is to protect and lift up as blameless and white as snow his wife. And I have to ask, the subtleties of that teaching to his wife, the implicit teaching. So he's willing to say that in an explicit way, to say it from the place of power it is, or privileges, it is easy to say, no, this is just to protect, this is just to lift up, this is a good thing, this is my place. This is actually a concern with us having this conversation about liberation theology, by the way. It is just for me to protect and to lift up. But implicitly, she is being taught. She is learning. She is hearing from her husband, you are not qualified to lift yourself up. You are not qualified to carry your own in faith. It is my job to carry you because you are not capable. The implicit teaching is absolutely devastating psychologically, faith and theologically. It is religiously oppressive. It is not simply a side factor in the conversation. It is how religion has abused and maintained power. To read Scripture from the place of those who are on the margins is to rip out those bonds of power and privilege. It is to undo the structures, the systems that are in place, both religious, church, societal, and otherwise. But we cannot begin that process if we do not begin by acknowledging that we have come to the table. We have come to Scripture, sola scriptura or not, with our tradition or not. We have come to the table with tradition and Scripture tightly wound together. And we cannot begin these conversations without teasing out those two things and identifying the bias that we come to the table with. Justo Gonzalez and Catherine Gonzalez, which I'm going to rely on in part through this series simply because the way that they have written their book, it's called Liberation Preaching, the way that they have written their book is to walk the church in part through this conversation. And he says, you can't do this on the surface. You can't academically go and say, okay, we're going to study this from a different perspective, because you lose the weight behind it. He says you have to internally acknowledge the discord within yourself and your tradition first. Then you begin applying that discord in other experiences. And then lastly, you bring that back to the table to interpret anew your Scripture. This begins with us acknowledging where we come from, how we approach Scripture, and acknowledging the cognitive dissonance within that space. If we're not there, we're not there. We can't force this on ourselves. We come with bias. We come with varying levels and degrees and cross-sectionality of privilege. And we come with an agenda, whether we want to believe it or not. Liberation theology is in its starting moment, in its impetus to begin to break down those biases so that we can read Scripture from a different place, so that we can read Scripture without the baggage of our biases in place. Successful or unsuccessful might be the the key point at the close of that, because we can't fully do that. But the more we acknowledge, the better we do. And when we don't acknowledge our bias going into reading, we completely fail in attempting to read plainly, if that's a thing. Husto and Catherine in a line make this great point, saying actually the two are probably closely linked. The greater your unwillingness to recognize your bias, the greater your bias will play in your interpretation. So if we can begin acknowledging pieces here and there, we can slowly begin pulling out our bias from our own interpretation. Thanks for listening to this sermon podcast from Open Door Church. Our intro and outro music was created by Lee Rosevere and is used under a Creative Commons by attribution license. Have a great week. Ask the hard questions and explore God's love. Everyone is always welcome to join the journey with us at Open Door. Learn more at opendoorfamily.ca. That's opendoorfamily.ca.